In 2023, 36.8 million Americans lived in poverty under the Census Bureau's official poverty measure. Poverty is something that America has fought a war against, yet it persists as a large issue in American society. However, America's understanding of poverty is often simply put in monetary terms, that the existence of poverty is the lack of income and monetary resources. However, this view of American poverty fails to understand the complex nature of its existence. Growing up, defining poverty can seem like a gut reaction to a state. You know it when you see it. But when we examine the details, defining poverty is an incredibly complex issue that defines what we as a society care about. In this video, we will argue that we should understand poverty as a range that cannot be understood by a single percentage. The best way to encapsulate this range is through a capabilities approach that understands poverty not just as an individual issue, but as an experience shaped by myriad personal, social, and environmental factors. In addressing poverty, we should seek to maximize opportunity. But before we get into this approach in detail, it's important to examine why other conceptions of poverty aren't up to the job, especially in America.
According to Robert Rector, research fellow at the Heritage Foundation, Americans tend to associate poverty with extremely desperate living conditions. Each year in the 90s and 2000s, the United States Census Bureau would put out reports saying that around 30 million Americans were in poverty. According to Rector, this made it seem like America was a greatly impoverished nation where 1 in 10 Americans didn't have enough food on the table or were constantly at risk of losing their house. But Rector thinks that this is a misstatement of American poverty. He is correct in saying this. Poverty in America is a much different situation than anywhere else in the world. One statistic he points to is that the average poor American has more living space than the average European. We should not think of poverty in extreme measures. Doing so misunderstands the progress that we need to make. Looking at Rector's data, it appears that practically all poor households in the United States have modern amenities such as a stove and oven, television, and refrigerator. Furthermore, over half of the poor population in the United States has a washer and dryer, air conditioning, even a DVD player. Comparing these to other parts of the world, poverty clearly is different in the United States.
Looking just at what American households have is a misleading way of approaching poverty. There are a couple of key issues with Rector's framing of this. First is income variability. Households may have bought these goods when they were making relatively decent amounts of income, but if they're experiencing hardship, those assets aren't reflective of their current living conditions. Second, Rector's approach doesn't understand the condition that Americans get these goods in. For example, they could have gotten it used at a garage sale or from a donation. Having that asset would not be reflective of where they are at. And third is that this undermines their dignity. Americans should have choice in what they are pursuing so that they can lead a high quality of life. Rector repeatedly argues that Americans are well nourished, but breaking it down, about three-fourths of all households say that they have enough food of the kinds that they want to eat. However, under 50% of poor households report the same. This choice is incredibly important for quality of life. Americans should have the dignity of having the food that they want so that their life can have meaning and can have fulfillment. Rector's argument is that Americans have their basic needs met. Rector repeatedly compares poor households in America today to the soldiers that stormed the beaches of Normandy in World War II, saying that people in poverty are better off than they were. However, we shouldn't look to the past to understand the condition of poverty today. Rector says that Americans have access to assets and amenities. However, he says that, quote, poor households tend to obtain modern conveniences about a dozen years after the middle class. This inequality should be a massive informant of how we approach poverty and not something that we accept. Our definition needs to be constantly shifting to adapt to social structures.
What if we looked at what someone can do rather than what they have done? The capabilities approach avoids many flaws of the other measurements. For example, no funneling of many areas of human life into just one number occurs within the capabilities approach, as all aspects of life are addressed. Also, is it fair to apply one measurement for all countries of the world? With capabilities, we are obviously looking at what people are actually able to do or be. Looking for a set of opportunities, not results, allows this approach to not be overbearing and treats people with dignity. No one is forced into any certain functioning or result. An example of this is the difference between someone who is starving and someone who is performing a religious fast. Both of their functionings or result is hunger, but the person on the fast has the capability to eat if desired, while the other person does not. Thanks to the capabilities approach, we clearly know who needs help and who does not. This brings us to central capabilities. These are the core abilities examined through the capabilities approach when looking into someone's life to see whether they need help or not. As seen on this list of central capabilities, overarching themes of health and social freedoms are addressed. This is because poverty is more than just money and dollar signs. For example, the central capability of play takes into account how much free time someone has. This shows the advantage of the capabilities approach. Let's say that someone goes into some big time Wall Street job. In this case, they are choosing to have horrible working hours with not much free time. However, if someone has to work 3 jobs to barely get by, they might have what other approaches consider a decent income, but they are forced into a diminished quality of life.
While this approach may seem more difficult to measure, we can instead measure it by breaking it into different areas. For example, we can look at the central capability of life by seeing if different groups have different life expectancy, and then investigate. Nussbaum says that if a functioning is missing, we should look to see if there are barriers that people are facing, suggesting the absence of a capability. Across the central capabilities, we can look to adequately address the causes by looking at functionings through proxy measurements like life expectancy or school attendance. One way that this is currently done is the United Nations Multidimensional Poverty Index. This annual report breaks dimensions of human well being, like health, into metrics like child mortality. While this metric isn't as useful in more developed countries like the United States, it shows how we can effectively measure these proxies for capabilities. Amartya Sen, one of the leading thinkers behind the capabilities approach, fears having these lists out of the concern that it could lead to cultural imperialism through the imposition of certain values. However, by adequately crafting what we are looking at to each locality and each country, we can make sure that we do not fall into this trap. For example, the Multidimensional Poverty Index sets one standard for parental education: the completion of primary school. We believe that standards should vary along where a country is in its development process. In the US, where there is a strong compulsory schooling system, high school graduation rates could be a more effective metric, but primary schooling would be a better measure in a country or region without a rigid schooling system. But all of this begs the question: why not just look at money? If poverty is an experience, why not look at the instrumental tool that can assess whether one has adequate living conditions? This is the approach that the United States currently takes with metrics like the official poverty measure and the supplemental poverty measure. However, this does not adequately describe one's standards of living. Different people do different things with the same amount of income. Someone with a disability might face far higher expenses. This also falls into what Nussbaum calls the fallacy of measurement, where we gain tunnel vision on just making sure that people have enough income. What we care about with poverty is making sure that people have an adequate standard of living. We shouldn't just look at one instrumental tool in monetary resources to find this. In addressing poverty, we should instead look at conversion factors, which determine whether someone can turn a resource into a functioning. Various personal, social, and environmental factors are often structural barriers that we must address if we want every person to have access to a dignified life of their choosing. For example, strengthening literacy could help more people make it through the school system and have more choices in determining a future career.
So, American poverty is a multifaceted social and economic issue. One clean metric cannot help us fix its many causes. We should instead address one's central capabilities to maximize quality of life. So, poverty is an experience, not a line or an easy percentage.